Hello, this is week 6. We're starting to talk about the Baroque, and so on this unit, we're going to continue our discussion, part 2 of our discussion about painting. And if you remember, in week 5, we talked about 3 main painting mediums, the ones that were primarily most dominant before the Renaissance. So that was fresco, um, encaustic, and egg tempera. And in this one, we're going to concentrate primarily on oil painting, but we will also discuss watercolor and gouache and a little bit of acrylic. Um, but there's even more that we could discuss. I don't have time to talk about casein paints or alkyds or enamels. Um, so, but we do what we can. So let's start with watercolor. If we remember from last week, as we talked about painting, uh, one of the main ways to think about different painting mediums is what is the binder. So, because in all of these paints, the pigments are basically the same. That there's a pigment called burnt sienna, which is a ground up clay and it contains certain impurities, and it comes from the region around sienna, and it's called burnt sienna because it's the color that that clay gets when it's been baked in an oven. So that pigment is used in paints of various kinds. You could buy a tube of watercolor, you could buy a tube of acrylic, you could buy a tube of oil, and they would all have that same pigment in them. What's different between the different types of paints is the binder. Now, that being stated, it is true that there are some pigments that work very well for certain media, certain types of paint, but not for others. But in general, the pigment is the color, and that is the same from one kind of paint to another. So watercolor is seems like a very simple thing, which is to paint with paint embedded in water. But actually, it was a rather tricky thing for artists to do. Artists had been able to make suspensions of pigments in water for the longest of time. In fact, that's how frescoes were worked. But to truly make a paint where the paint was actually soluble in the water required discovering the properties of gum arabic. So in watercolor, the water is not the binder. The water is the medium, but the gum arabic is what is mixed with the paint so that then the paint can be dispersed as a solution in the water. Watercolor gives us very transparent effects. You can build up in layers. Also, those who study watercolor find that it's in some ways a tricky way to work because you kind of work opposite the way many other painters work. You can't add lights, or it's tricky to add lights. You have to get opaque in order to do that. So that when you're working with watercolors, you primarily build your darks more and more, thinking a lot in the same ways that people think when they're drawing. So, but that means then in order for you to have light areas, you have to think about leaving those with as much of the white of the paper as possible. So it's a different way of thinking. But there is an opaque version of watercolor, and that's called gouache. The binder here is also gum arabic, but there's some slight chemical properties, some things, additives that are added to the pigment, to the paint, to make these paints very, very opaque. And there are lots of artists who combine gouache and watercolor as well. Here's an example of Matisse used gouache as a means of coloring papers and then doing cut paper pieces. So this is a cut paper, might say a collage or kind of a cut paper drawing of a figure, but the paper is hand colored. It was not a bought paper, that color. He hand painted that with gouache. So, in the last lecture, if you remember, we talked a little bit about the transition in Northern Renaissance from a culture of painting with egg tempera to a culture painting with oil paint. And if we knew exactly who invented oil paint, it would be fantastic. But we don't. But we do know that it certainly happened right around the time of Jan van Eyck, and that Jan van Eyck truly is the artist who took advantage of that transition. Before Jan van Eyck, it was quite common to work in oil layers on top of an egg tempera painting. And then after Jan van Eyck, it became quite common to work either where you used egg tempera just for an underpainting and then entirely in oil paints on top, or even just working in oil paints completely. Um, and so, but the artist that I want to talk about in terms of, to me, the most important oil painter who really kind of radically changed what artists thought oil painting could do and was about is Titian. Like we learned from our lecture uh, on the Renaissance, I am kind of a huge Titian fan, and I think the world of him as a painter, and especially of his influence. You know, the transition from the Renaissance to the Baroque doesn't really make sense without looking at Titian. Um, and Titian was such an influential painter. Painters like Velázquez and Rubens so admired him, and for good reason, because he was a beautiful painter, and he made painting be about the mark making. It's a little bit hard to see sometimes when you're looking at these early paintings, but you can begin to see what he was thinking about here, like in that cloth right there. That for Titian, it's the applying of paint, the ability with oil paint to make it about the marks themselves and how the marks create the form. That's what painting is about. This is probably a good place to stop on this lecture. And hold on a second, if I can. Well, there we go. I'm going to end here, and then we'll start up again.